Good evening, everyone. I'm Eve Kahn. I'm a proud board member of the Victorian Society's New York chapter. Welcome, welcome, everyone. I am honored to be introducing tonight's star in a moment. Keep in mind we have fantastic upcoming events in the works, including for a new book about Gilded Age fortune tellers, talk about women and the agency, and new discoveries about the 1839 Amistad uprising and its connections to the New York area. We have a speaker on the Angel of the Waters, the glorious fountain, Bethesda Fountain. There's a new book on that. And we've got a woman who's made amazing discoveries about some relatives of hers who were killed on the Titanic. There's a new book, and we're going to be setting up these events. So keep an eye on our Eventbrite page. And now tonight's star, Dr. Livia Woods. She's a PhD from the CUNY Graduate Center. She's Associate Professor of English at the University of Illinois at Springfield. Her research focuses on British Victorian literature and culture, women's and gender studies, and the medical humanities. Livia, I'm so glad that we made this connection and that you're presenting for us tonight. I'm really looking forward to your discoveries about this fascinating undiscovered, understudied subject. So welcome to our virtual stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad to be here. I'm just going to take a minute to get set up some screen share here. All right. Do we have good visibility for everybody there? Awesome. So I'm going to be talking for the next 30-40 minutes about my recently published book, Pregnancy in the Victorian Novel, which is out from the Ohio State University Press this fall. And what I mean, this is the first book of a literary scholar. So there's lots of kind of deep scholarly stuff, really particular to my area, that I'm just going to glance over for the purposes of today's talk. But I'm happy to talk about any of that more if it's interesting to people in the Q&A. And what I want to focus on now is to sort of sketch out the broad outlines of the way that pregnancy is and is not represented in Victorian novels. And I want to be clear that while Victorian novels are literary artifacts that were shaped by and in turn shaped history and sort of real lived experience, what I'm looking at isn't how did Victorian women actually experience pregnancy? What I'm looking at is how is pregnancy represented or not in the artifact, in the novel, the sort of shape of the narrative. And so the basic gist, which is not terribly surprising to those of us familiar with the Victorian period, and which I sort of assumed when I started this project over a decade ago. I assumed that I would find a wealth of work saying just this, but actually there's just very little work on pregnancy in the Victorian novel. And so the basic gist is that Victorian novels, unsurprisingly, tend to be pretty tight-lipped about the representation of pregnancy as an embodied experience. Pregnancy does sometimes get glancingly mentioned, euphemistically noted, very lightly touched upon in ways where you know that a character is pregnant. But for the most part, if a character conforms to feminine norms, if a character is broadly doing sort of what she is supposed to be doing, the novel will not reveal her pregnant body as having any bodily specifics. So she won't be described as being heavy. She won't be described as being uncomfortable in any way. Certainly she won't be described as like taking up space or having an enlarged belly or like enlarged breasts or anything like that. I imagine that kind of goes without saying. But so none of those, for the most part, Victorian novels do not represent pregnancy as an experience of the body. And so I want to start this sort of first slide here, just glancing at an example of a relatively explicit depiction of pregnancy, but that conforms to this basic tendency, where what we're being really clearly told that this character is pregnant, but we're being told in a way that leaves the body completely out of it. And this is, I wouldn't say paradigmatic, because what's more paradigmatic of pregnancy in the Victorian novel is not something this explicit. This is unusually explicit, but it's paradigmatic of the way that the body is left out of the conversation. So this is from Charles Dickens's Our Mutual Friend. And for those who don't know the novel, I wouldn't even begin to attempt to give you a summary of the entire plot. I just want to sketch out this one because it's one of those Dickens novels with this just teeming with characters. But I want to sketch out the one plot that we need to understand the context of this quote, which is that Bella Wilfer, who becomes Bella Harmon, who becomes Bella Ropesmith because of a concealed identity plot with the man that she ends up marrying. She starts the novel as a kind of fortune hunter. And so for much of the first 2/3 of the novel, she is needing to learn certain lessons about good behavior and moral relationships to others. And when we meet her here, she's been married to the husband for a little under a year. And she has started to learn those lessons, and the novel is sort of reintegrating her into the sort of norms of good womanhood. And so she is telling, what's happening in this passage is that she's telling her husband, John, that she is pregnant. And it picks up, they're sort of in a conversation where he keeps asking her, like, why are you so serious? Why are you so serious? And she says things about it, but doesn't quite finish her sentences. And he says, oh, it must be this. And then she says, no, it's not that. And then we pick up with this passage you have in front of you. This is Bella speaking. It was quite another sort of seriousness, a much deeper and quieter sort of seriousness that I spoke of, John dear. As he bent his face to hers, she raised hers to meet it and laid her little right hand on his eyes and kept it there. Do you remember, John, on the day we were married, Pa's speaking of the ships that might be sailing toward us from the unknown seas? Perfectly, my darling, says John. I think, and this is this final bolded section there, I think, ... among them, ... there is a ship upon the ocean, ... bringing, ... to you and me, ... a little baby, John. So clearly, even a not particularly savvy reader would understand what she is saying, which is that they are expecting a baby. And of course, what she's saying is that she is pregnant. But the extreme distance here between the very possibility of her speaking about her body and what she's able just barely to actually say is the norm in Victorian fiction. So I want to just, obviously the bolding here is giving you a key where I'm going, but I do want to just make it explicit that what's happening is that everything about what she's saying has to be, it's very hesitating. It has to be quiet. It has to be that which cannot be known. There are all of the ellipses of hesitation, the desire not to speak. And I want to point out too that she starts by covering her husband's eyes so that he can't even see her, like even in the text, he can't see her body as she's being described as telling him this thing. And then, I mean, you know, I suppose the ship or the ocean is maybe the maternal, there's the suggestion of the possibility of a maternal body there, but I mean, that's a pretty, and especially because she is referencing back to an earlier scene in the novel in which her father told them that marriage was like embarking on a sea journey. So it's not even, and that in that instance, it's not a reference to pregnancy or the sexual body in any way. So this is a good example where we can see really clearly how the majority of Victorian novels, when they encounter a need to name pregnancy because it's a salient plot point, how they do it, which is not by saying she needed a little extra space, or she's upstairs throwing up, or she's loosened her stays, or any of the other things that might indicate something about the body. And again, this is not a earth-shattering observation. Victorian novels are modest about depictions of the body in general, and they're particularly modest about depictions of the sexual body, and they're particularly modest about depictions of the feminine sexual body. So for the most part, if you think about all the Victorian novels you've ever read, you're not going to think of a lot of clear depictions of pregnancy. When pregnancy is depicted explicitly as something that has to do with the body, it is almost always in an instance of maternal misbehavior, a situation in which a female character has done something that she's not supposed to do. Sometimes there's the sort of hint of possible immorality, like she's transgressed her marriage, like Kathy in Wuthering Heights would be an example of that. Sometimes she has had sex out of wedlock, Ruth in Elizabeth Gaskell's Ruth, or Hetty in Adam Bede. Sometimes she's just not a very good person, as we're going to see. At least that's the sort of the implication of Rosamund Vincy and George Eliot's Middlemarch, which we're going to look at much more closely in a second. But for the most part, and I would say until the 1880s, always, when a character is represented in a Victorian novel as being pregnant with a body, it's because she's being revealed to narrative judgment. And the texts, the novels set us up as readers to perceive those bodies judgmentally. And so I think that the other thing that I want to set up about this before we head into looking at the Middlemarch is that this is the case. We're primed as readers to see these representations judgmentally. And what's being represented to us is usually the sort of shamed body, a shameful body. Most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time when a pregnancy is represented in a Victorian novel, it's also because something goes wrong, which is why it needs to be treated at the level of plot, why the novel needs to narrate it. And so usually when a pregnancy gets represented, either there's a pregnancy loss or infant death or maternal death. So that's the other sort of key thing about this, is that these pregnancies that get represented as maternal shame, not as maternal pain or suffering. And I think that's what I want us to take a much closer look at here with George Eliot's Middlemarch. So again, I'm not going to attempt to do a summary of the entirety of Middlemarch, which is also famous for its teeming characters. But I want to track Rosamund Vincy, who becomes Rosamund Lydgate when she marries the doctor, Tertius Lydgate, who's one of the two sort of twinned protagonists in the novel. So Rosamund is depicted in Eliot's novel as a silly, scheming girl who really wants to marry slightly above her social rank, who wants access to as much money as she needs to be comfortable, who wants to flirt, who isn't particularly interested in sort of nurturing others or perceiving the needs or feelings of others. And Middlemarch is a novel that all of the central plots in Middlemarch have these moments of failed or realized revelation where the self recognizes the existence of the other. And Rosamund herself has such a moment, but that moment is very partial. It comes in the novel basically at the point where she's revealed to Dorothea, the other main protagonist, as having been willing to have an affair. She doesn't go through with it, but that's sort of what's happening. And so basically what prompts her to realize that other people exist is the notion that other people might see her being bad. So it's not this kind of like deep realization of empathy and of the other. And so in the meantime, she tanks her husband's career by failing to be a supportive wife. So this is, and like Hetty, the pregnant character in George Eliot's first novel, Adam Bede, 1859, Rosamond is sometimes talked about by George Eliot scholars as being, George Eliot was so concerned with the ways the novel could teach us to sympathize, the way that the novel could teach us to recognize the other, the experience of the other. And Hetty and Rosamond, as well as some other Eliot characters, are often talked about as being excluded from those sympathetic networks in the novel. That Middlemarch isn't interested in helping us empathize with Rosamond. And I think that's another sort of framing piece of information here, looking at these passages that show us a little bit about the course of her pregnancy as it's narrated in the novel. So we've already had indications that she's pregnant, and we already actually know that she loses the pregnancy before we get to this moment, but they've been very passing. This is the moment where we start to get more information about it, and this chapter, in fact, this chapter in book 6 is the chapter in which Rosamond's pregnancy loss is narrated in pretty great detail. It's all in hindsight. It's already happened. And the narrative perspective is pretty closely aligned with the narrative perspective of her husband, who again is a doctor. So looking at this quote here, Rosamond's baby had been born prematurely, and all the embroidered robes and caps had to be laid by in darkness. This misfortune was attributed entirely to her having persisted in going out on horseback one day when her husband had desired her not to do so. So, this voice telling us this misfortune was attributed entirely to her having persisted in going out on horseback one day when her husband had desired her not to do so. This voice of the narrator has a lot of spin on it, right? Like we can feel the disdain for Rosamond here. The was attributed entirely is very passive. Like who is doing that? Nobody in particular. Of course, we come to learn in this chapter that her husband is doing that. His medical judgment and his husbandly judgment is that it's her fault. He's not able to say that directly to her, and the chapter says explicitly, like, he can't tell her that he's angry, but he is. And so that was attributed entirely sort of just floats around, and it ends up, I think, becoming a pretty apt description of how almost all scholarship has treated Rosamond's miscarriage as, in the narrative structure of the novel, the punishment that she reaps for failing to obey her husband, who had told her to stop riding on horseback because she was pregnant. They had had a previous conversation about this, but she persisted. So she did it even though she was told not to. And so that's the kind of basic setup there. And for the most part, this has been the way that Rosamond's pregnancy has been understood. However, I want us to take a look. I'm sorry, I'm sort of having to shuffle around my screen here so that I can see the passages. I want us to take a look at some of the interesting things that we don't see when we read Rosamond's pregnancy as primarily narrative evidence of her failings. So these passages are both from that same chapter. They come a little bit later. So the gentle gray, the horse that she's riding when this, or right before this happens, unprepared for the crash of a tree that was being felled on the edge of Halsell Wood, took fright and caused a worse fright to Rosamond, leading finally to the loss of her baby. What actually happens here is pretty unclear, especially in the context of a novel that, again, like does exclude Rosamond from the sympathetic networks. We're not really encouraged to see the depth of her personality as being meaningful. And so it would be very easy for the horse to fall and for her to get hit, or for her her body to fall on the ground. It would be very easy for her to fall from the horse. It would be very easy to depict her as falling and then getting kicked by the horse. Something that would be at least within the structure of the logic that we've already seen at play here, a direct explanation for how this accident while horseback riding causes her to lose the pregnancy. But this leading finally to the loss of her baby after it sounds like the horse gets scared, she gets scared, and then at some point, question mark, question mark, question mark timeline, she loses the baby. And just to take us back to that previous slide, oh, sorry, I'm moving the wrong direction. There we go. Was attributed entirely to her having persisted in going out on horseback one day. So, and also it's not, that passage doesn't say was attributed entirely to the accident that she had when her horse got scared and fell, or she fell, or whatever it was that might have happened. But was attributed entirely to her having persisted. So it was the not following the orders that it's attributed to, not to anything specific that happened to her body. And that we don't actually know, does that mean she went home and immediately delivered a stillborn baby? Does that mean that she went home and immediately went into preterm labor? Or does it mean that 6 days later she lost the pregnancy? That's of course very unclear, except that we know that it was attributed entirely to this event. However, we also have this passage below in this chapter, which is that in all future conversations on the subject of the loss, Rosamond was mildly certain that the ride had made no difference, and that if she had stayed at home, the same symptoms would have come on and would have ended in the same way, because she had felt something like them before. I can't expect, because this is a Victorian novel, this actually feels like very lightly embodied as a statement. But having read all of the articulations of pregnancy in Victorian novels I can lay my hands on, this is radically specific about a woman articulating having had an internal embodied experience of being pregnant. We get that very seldom in literature of this period. And what she's saying is that she had been feeling something for a long time before this happened. I have to imagine, there are explanations for this that we could imagine, that she's, for example, experiencing contractions, and that ends up being what happens. The tone, the sort of narrative tilt on Rosamond is evident here as well. We see it in the mildly certain, as though she's basically really chill about what happened. It's just not a big deal, this pregnancy loss. And she just sort of casually says, whenever it comes up, she's like, I think it would have happened anyway. No big deal. Which, Rosamond's not a real person. And if she were a real person, I don't know her. So like, maybe she feels that way. But I just want to flag, this is where I want to stop first and flag some things that we need a strong attention on, like, what we know about bodies that experience what's being depicted here. So Rosamond, and I've done the math on this, is at least 5 months pregnant. She might be as much as 7 months pregnant. She's between 22 and 30 weeks pregnant when she loses this pregnancy. So she delivers a baby. And even if she didn't want that baby, even if she intentionally triggers a miscarriage, which is what in 2016, a colleague of mine, Doreen Thuruf, wrote an article in which she reads this scene as an abortion. Even if that's the case, she does that without anesthesia. This is incredibly painful. And so what's mildly certain is a strange descriptor as the primary language for what her experience is. It's not that she might well feel chill about all of this after it's happened, especially if she didn't want to be pregnant, especially if she didn't want this pregnancy and she was intentionally doing what she had been told could trigger labor before the child could survive. If that's the case, she may well be mild in her feelings about that loss afterwards. But there's certainly pain here that does not, or a situation like this certainly entails a lot of physical pain, and nothing in this chapter represents that physical pain. So whether or not I don't particularly like Rosamond as a character. I'm not seeking to reclaim her as a wonderful paragon of goodness. But whether or not she is a good person or a bad person or a good character or a bad character, the experience she is described as having without pain would certainly entail pain if a person were to have it. And on that note, I want to take us to this last passage from Middlemarch before broadening way out, which is this paragraph from a much later chapter in the novel, I think the final book, book 8, in which that plot of hers that I was narrating, this is that moment where she is revealed to Dorothea as being in an indiscreet relationship with Will Ladislaw. So someone outside of her private sphere sees her doing something she is not supposed to do, which triggers in her the closest thing that she gets to a revelation of the self. And this is the moment, and it's not only that having been seen triggers that, but then Will Ladislaw, who is in love with Dorothea and ends up marrying Dorothea, is so upset at having been seen in that relationship with Rosamond by Dorothea, who he loves, that he leaves. He's mad at her and he storms out and is basically frustrated, feels that she has like tricked him into this position or whatever, which I mean, I think we can take that with a grain of salt too. But so this is after he storms out. And this is a passage that is not, I've never encountered this passage being read in comparison with the pregnancy plot for Rosamond, but it's a passage that I read as relevant there. So Rosamond tried to get up from her seat, but fell back fainting. When she came to herself again, she felt too ill to make the exertion of rising to ring the bell, and she remained helpless until the girl, surprised at her long absence, thought for the first time of looking for her in all the downstairs rooms. Rosamond said that she had felt suddenly sick and faint and wanted to be helped upstairs. When there, she threw herself on the bed with her clothes on and lay in apparent torpor, as she had done once before on a memorable day of grief. So I'm sorry, I've lost there we go. There's been no representation in this novel of a memorable day of grief for Rosamond. That's not there have been she's depicted as having a hard time when her husband to be, Tertius Lydgate, stops coming to call because he is told basically that people expect he should propose to her and he doesn't really want to propose to her. So he stops making social calls, and she had assumed that he was going to propose to her. And so she's really upset when he stops courting her, basically. But that's not a memorable day of grief, and that's not described as a single day. It's not described as it's not described as grief exactly. It's just described as like disappointment and depression. But it's certainly not described as being a single day. There is no single day in Rosamond's narration, in the narration of Rosamond in this novel, that is described as being a memorable day of grief. But I can think of one possibility, and I can't prove that. This is suggestive to me. And it's suggestive to me of the possibility that Rosamond might have feelings, even if she didn't want to be pregnant, about losing a 22 to 30 week pregnancy and the experience of that. So I think that what what reading Victorian novels, because this dynamic that I've just sketched in Middlemarch is common in, again, the way that pregnancies get narrated across the board when they are narrated as embodied experiences. They're narrated as being maternal guilt is narrated and maternal pain is not narrated. And Victorian novels tell the story of pregnancy as a story of either you don't see it and then there's a baby, or you do see it and the woman has done something wrong. They do not tell the story of the possibility that pregnancy is also an experience of embodiment for women or pregnant people. And they certainly don't tell the story of the possibility that pregnancy is an experience of pain. So I think that that's kind of where I want to stop with the book stuff, but I want to end on a final note before opening up for Q&A here, which is to think a little bit about why this plot of the narration of pregnancy as always already indicating maternal guilt is relevant to us. And I wish I didn't need to, I wish it weren't so easy to make this case. And for most of the time that I was working on this project and writing this book, it wasn't so easy to make the case that this narrative structure, which is established, so this narrative structure for the representation of pregnancy in literature or in art more broadly, in human artifacts, we do not find this in all cultures. We certainly find wide-ranging and not always sort of positive relationships to the depiction of pregnancy or female experience. But this is really this plot in which pregnancy is not visible, and if it is visible, it's because the woman has done something wrong. That plot is an innovation of Victorian literature, and it's an innovation that is alive and well. And so I don't know how many people were following this terrible news story out of Ohio earlier this month. But this woman who you can see at the bottom of the photo here, Brittany Watts, was 21 weeks pregnant. There was some crisis in the pregnancy. I think the details of that are not publicly known for good reason, because they're her private medical information. She went to the hospital and was refused treatment. For 8 hours, she sat in the waiting room. The strong implication is that that's because the treatment would have been to terminate the pregnancy, and that Ohio is a state where that would not have been legal. So she went home. She went back to the hospital the next day, was refused treatment again, and went home. And then a lot of the coverage refers to it as a miscarriage, but after 20 weeks, it's actually a stillbirth. So she went home and delivered a stillborn baby alone in her bathroom. She had not told anyone that she was pregnant. So it sounds like I won't ascribe any intentions. She tried to go to an appointment that she'd already had for a haircut or something. And the woman who was cutting her hair said, like, you seem really not okay. And she told her what had happened. And she said, you have to go to the hospital. So she went to the hospital, where they performed a D&C to take out what remained of the undelivered placenta in her body, at which point the hospital reported her to the police, who went to her house and found the remains of the stillborn baby in her toilet, and said to her, like, why is this there? And she said that she had tried to dispose of the remains elsewhere, and outside they found a bucket that had clots of blood and things. And so to me, this seems like a situation in which an overwhelmed person had been denied medical care for the course of many days while she was in preterm labor, ended up delivering a baby alone, had no idea where that baby even was in all of the blood. And then what she got charged, she got indicted. They decided not to charge her, as you can see from this headline, but she was indicted for abuse of a corpse because of where they found the body of the baby. And I mean, I think that this is a familiar plot to me as a reader of Victorian novels, and of pregnancy in Victorian novels. And I wish that it weren't. But I think we see this plot playing out repeatedly on the national stage at this point. And so the really unfortunate relevance of this research to our cultural context weighs heavily on me. And with that, I'm gonna wrap it up and open the floor for questions.
Oh, Olivia, thank you. Yeah, I remember following that coverage and just my heart broke for this poor, confused, right? And everyone is judging her, right? Everywhere she turns. Just terrible, terrible story. Yeah, just a horrible story. And yes, and your work is incredibly relevant today. Thank you. That was fascinating. You could have had, so are you telling me there's hundreds of Victorian novels in which there's this similar trope? How did you narrow down what you wanted to
No.
book?
So there are hundreds of Victorian novels in which a character is pregnant and not described as having a body. So there are hundreds of Victorian novels. Birth rates were very high in the Victorian period, and Victorian realist novels depict a universe that looks sort of similar to that Victorian historical period. And so lots of babies are born. And then in hindsight, you can assume there was a pregnancy that preceded the birth of a baby. There are lots of women in a delicate condition, or similar types of euphemism, like less explicit, but along the same lines as that Dickens passage that we took a look at. There are very few direct depictions of pregnancy as an embodied experience. And so mostly I didn't have a process of selection. Mostly I wrote about what there was. That's not true. So my first chapter has a section on Trollope, has a section on Wuthering Heights, and has a section on Charlotte Mary Young's The Clever Woman of the Family. My second chapter is the two most well-known depictions of pregnancy in the Victorian novel, which is Adam Bede by Eliot and Ruth by Elizabeth Gaskell. The third chapter is just Middlemarch and some of that material I was just sharing. The fourth chapter, though, is a fin de siècle chapter. And certainly once we get to about 1885, at that point in the final chapter, I was selecting because there's a kind of explosion of visible pregnancy in the late Victorian period that I think we can also, it's not a one-to-one at all. But I think that within our own cultural context, we can perceive similar types of explosions in sort of legible, visible pregnancy occurring about the end of the 20th century. You know, if you think about the Demi Moore cover of Vanity Fair, where she's naked and very pregnant, and the sort of a tumult around that issue, but this, or a celebrity cultures of bump watching and sort of like celebrity pregnancy. So something similar happens at the end of the Victorian period, where the peak artistic form of the period, the novel, starts to narrate pregnancy as something that can be named. And so in the final chapter, I was making selections on the basis of an interest that I have in the way that those depictions center paternal experience. When people do start to tell the story of pregnancy in the Victorian novel, they tell the story of the fathers as the central characters in the pregnancies. So I made the selections of which novels to analyze on the basis of that. But for the most part, between 1838 and about 1885, there are very, very few direct depictions of pregnancy as an embodied condition.
So is there any particular author that you think of as blazing the trail by 1885 or so? Or what do you think the societal shifts were that made it okay to make this more vivid in literature?
I mean, I think kind of a lot of it would be, I'm not going to answer that question in its entirety because there are so many different things that contribute to that shift. Part of it is that the literary landscape is shifting. So where there had been clear distinctions between respectable literary realism, the novels that nice ladies read, and cheap trash, those distinctions, and I mean that I don't mean that I don't think that those texts are cheap trash, but that there was a perception of those distinctions, genre fiction, basically. I think that those distinctions, especially with the rise of sensation fiction in the 1860s, really start to get fuzzier in ways that allow the more spectacular plot points of sensation fiction to find a home in lots of other types of literature and novels. I think also, if we look at something like Darwin and the dissemination of ideas about reproduction as central to the human story, I think we see that impacting the ways that people are able to talk about it. And then, of course, we see also around the same period, we're seeing the rise of the sexologists in psychology. And a lot of what's happening with the representation of pregnancy at the fin de siècle is that pregnancy is being represented as a psychological state primarily decided by the paternal condition. So it's all wrapped up in that. And I think I'll pause the answer there, but like there are many, many things that enable that shift, but I think those are some big parts of it.
So Anne says that literally even in diaries of the time, and Anne, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself, in diaries of the time, people don't describe being pregnant. People don't say, I felt sick this morning. I know. Pa says the sea is changing. They don't even use that euphemism. They just don't mention it until they give birth.
No, in private spaces, women talk about pregnancy. And in medical contexts, men talk about pregnancy because, of course, and this is something that's a huge part of my book, but that I didn't even touch on until this moment, which is that in the 19th century, what we're seeing is the medicalization of women's reproductive bodies. So at the beginning of the 19th century, very few women living in Britain would have received medical care over the course of a pregnancy, childbirth, or postpartum period. And by the end of the century, not to mention if we go just 20 years further into, say, 1920, we see not exact, by the end of the century, we don't see the majority, but by 1920, we do see the majority of women receiving some kind of medical care. And so the medicalization of pregnancy that's happening means that there's a lot of naming, articulating pregnancy in published material. It's just not in novels. And it's for a specialized audience. There are also there are guides to pregnancy that are published for women, not for specialists, but for women themselves for the first time in the Victorian period. Actually, right before it's 1832, I think, is the big manual. And so, but those that's not about telling the story of it, right? That's about providing information, which is really different, I think, than the idea of like, let me tell you this story. Let me tell you the story, because when you tell someone a story, you select the relevant material to articulate and you deselect the irrelevant material. And that's what's so important about what we're seeing with that Middlemarch example, is that the relevant material to articulate is what a bad woman Rosamond is. The irrelevant material to articulate is that it really hurts to give birth to a 25-week fetus. And so we find it a lot in diaries. We find it a lot in letters. We find it in Queen Victoria's letters to her daughter. She hated being pregnant. She talked about it as being like an animal. She talked about it as being like a guinea pig. I'm just like shooting babies out all the time. She really didn't like it. So in private circles, you can name pregnancy. And we know, of course, that women were talking about it to each other. But in the novel, in this sort of like container for the stories, the shapes, the plots that allow people, according to Eliot and many other Victorian novels, to imagine the existence of the other. We are not imagining the experience of pregnancy as relevant. Does that answer the question about?
Yeah, that's fascinating. And then Phyllis points out that in War and Peace and Anna Karenina, right? There's in vivid detail. Is that right? I don't know if Phyllis, if you wanted to unmute. Do you want to comment on that, Livia? That it was that
Yeah.
I know
So
that's
it's
outside your national
Well, I
border.
think, yeah, so this is, I said when we were arranging for this session, I said, just so you know, I'm going to be talking about British Victorian. So definitely this is one of the ways where we can see all of those stereotypes about what the Victorian period was, the way that that's the sort of tight-lipped, don't talk about sex stereotypes. We see that really strongly in the British Victorian context, and we see it very differently in different cultural contexts. And so even I do not have any titles even to cite, but if we look, I know that if we look at the American context, we're going to find less these tendencies are going to not map onto the American context as tidily. They are certainly not going to map onto the French context as tidily, and they certainly do not map onto the Russian context, in which those notable examples are key. And so really when I said this is an innovation of the British Victorian period, like this is an innovation of the British Victorian period. But the British Victorian period had an outsized influence on the way that we tell stories.
Julie, did I unmute you? Julie, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, yes. Hello. Sorry, I was trying to start my video. I can't start my video. Hi.
Hi.
Um I just wanted, yeah, I was thinking about Livia, your practice of somatic reading, and this space of uncertainty, and trying to enact that, right, as a way of reading, and all of the sort of many quotes you provided us that, or like examples. So I'm thinking of, right, Rosamond, like her knowing with certainty that it wasn't the horseback riding, right, that was the cause of, right, the loss of the pregnancy, and yet that sort of uh very decided narrative voice that tells us like it's her like determined persistence to ride that did that, and then in giving us, right, this very current example of this sort of like not knowing, so this like really gray area around somatic aspects of knowing and not knowing, and like like a lived embodied experience of that women hold that is being recorded in ways that aren't easy to track as a literary scholar, as like a sort of uh in terms of the way traditional sort of research and analysis. I'm interested in what you have to say to us about sort of this as a practice of what you are doing, of like acknowledging personal somatic experience as a relevant piece of data here. And you have cited many examples where people aren't reading in ways that you're showing us it's relevant to be reading. So yeah.
Yeah, so and this is sorry for the not literary scholars in the room, but this is the piece of the project that's kind of like what I was saying at the beginning, a deep dive into my particular field. But certainly in literary scholarship, there has been a strong disinclination to integrate personal experience into our analytical methods. I think, I mean, we could have a whole other conversation about that. It's often at the front of my mind these days in terms of the sort of crisis in the humanities and the requirement that we articulate our value, and the sort of coherence of our subjects. And so I think there are reasons for it, and it's not just nonsense or silliness. But it's the case that there's a really strong disinclination to include personal experience in our analytical methods. And this project, I think, is an example of how there are certain things that we just won't see it doesn't need to be always like your own personal experience of having had this happen to you. I hope that what happened to Rosamond Vinci doesn't happen to anyone in this Zoom. But your knowledge, either from your own life or from the lives of others, that like pregnant women have bodies. Sometimes they're uncomfortable. They get bigger. It seems like birth is painful. It seems like nursing is painful sometimes to people. Like that these contexts from your lived experience of the world and the lived experiences of people you know in the world can help you see things that are there in the novel, can help adjust that narrative, that narrative structure where certain things are relevant, like maternal guilt, and certain things are irrelevant, like maternal pain. And that's a narrative structure that we need to adjust, and that our contemporary contexts make it glaringly obvious we need to adjust. And so that the body is one of our ways into that. And I mean, I think like bodily experience, which is so often represented in the Victorian novel as moralized. It's sometimes it's the sort of angelic suffering of a character in illness, for example. There's work on this with tuberculosis. So sometimes it can be moralized positively, or it can be moralized negatively, as in the case with Rosamond. But we all know from our own experiences of the body that not every bodily experience you have, not every pain or pleasure is necessarily moral. Like sometimes you just stub your toe and it hurts for 5 minutes and then you never think about it again. And it's not a salient plot point in your life. It's not something it's not a verdict on your value as a person, or your knowledge of yourself. You just stubbed your toe. And so that the body can give us sometimes, not always, the body isn't like a perfect knower of the world in any way, but the body can sometimes give us ways of seeing how the depiction of bodily experience as moral isn't the whole story. So I hope that speaks to some of what you were asking about, Julie.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that answer.
And Jeremy, did you want to ask your question? You want to unmute?
Sure. I think I'm unmuted. I'll just basically read what I've written in the chat. So assuming that the coming of a child is important to the plot of some novels, if pregnancy is not mentioned, and I assume childbirth isn't mentioned either, at what point will the arrival of a child be discussed in the novel, and how is it done? Is there a typical way? Is there a typical time? Is the pregnancy ever mentioned as a retrospective now that it's passed? Or does the child just arrive? And also, is the whole period of nursing also ignored? But before you answer that, after I wrote this, I had another thought, and that was, I would assume that the mortality rates among pregnant women, new mothers, and newborn children were very high. And I just wonder whether it was such a fraught and difficult thing that it just was ignored, partly because it was so painful, until all that was passed and everything was all right and so on. Anyway, that's kind of a part two of the question.
Yeah. So actually, Victorian novels are less tight-lipped about both childbirth and nursing. I think that's because one simple answer that is a simplified answer for sure. Part of the reason is that pregnancy is an experience that is primarily meaningful to feminine subjectivity. And the birth of a child in the context of a novel is either an experience that's meaningful. Like if you think about Dickens's David Copperfield, for example, which opens at the scene of his birth. And it's not exactly explicit, like we're not watching the baby come out exactly, but like it's pretty clear what's going on. And that happens a lot in Victorian novels, that you have a woman upstairs giving birth. And that is, in David Copperfield, that's he starts at the beginning of his life, right? That's the famous beginning of that novel. Like I'll start at the beginning of my life. And so he does. And so sometimes it's depicted because it's the beginning of a story. And so that's back to where this project is really, and as a literary scholar who studies the novel, just in general, like we're looking at the narrative structure, right? And so the narrative structure is some stories start with a birth. And then also some stories just really shift with the birth. So like the Victorian novel is very concerned with lineage and reproduction of lineage. And so it's often a key plot point when an heir is born, for example, or things like that. And then, of course, because Victorian novels track social networks, the birth of a child is often very relevant to the social dynamics, to the interaction between people. You would think that pregnancy might be as well, but I think that the anxiety about feminine sexuality kind of downplays that. Nursing is interesting because it gets named a lot, but you can't ever tell exactly what's happening. So women are nursing babies all the time, but like half of the time it means they're kind of cooing at them. And you can't tell whether or not a nipple is out. And sometimes it is. But it's kind of vague in this way where nursing is a word that just covers such a wide range of things that it's more acceptable. And also I think just socially that there's less anxiety around nursing. And there are people who have done work on nursing in the Victorian period. And so I would want to refresh my memory of exactly what the arguments are about the social context that make that a more sort of nameable act. But the big takeaway, I think, is that like because nursing doesn't just mean breastfeeding, it gets named very often. And then the second question, the mortality rates, yes, very high. In fact, higher than they were about 100 years before the Victorian period, because with medicalization, we do start in the 20th century, we start to see payoff in mortality rates. First, we see drop off. Like as doctors are going from deathbeds to delivery rooms and not washing their hands, you have higher rates of maternal and infant mortality in the Victorian period than you had in the early 18th century. So yes, maternal mortality rates are very high. However, I think that actually, so the Victorian novel is in no way shy about infant death, for example. Babies die all the time, and it's totally normal, and there's no disinclination to name it the way that there's a disinclination to pregnancy. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, sorry, I was confused if there was another comment, but I'll just say that yeah, I think that actually there's a lot of comfort with death in the Victorian novel in general. There's a comfort with reproductive death. There just isn't a comfort with experiences of embodiment that are primarily a woman's own.
Okay,
Wow. It's so bizarre, right? It's okay to give birth, but it's not. It's absolutely wild, right? You can count on one hand how many times the actual embodiment of pregnancy is mentioned. Absolutely wild. Yeah, you've made amazing discoveries. Absolutely amazing, Livia. So one last question. Can you tell us about your next book?
Yeah, so we had this conversation before the Zoom room opened up. My next book is a zygote. In the parlance of pregnancy. I am in the very early research stages, so stay tuned for like 10 years. But it will probably be a book about Victorian cookbooks. My interest in embodied knowledge as necessary to the understanding of certain kinds of literary forms and depictions transfers over from the pregnancy project into the cookbook project. Cookbooks are There's food studies scholars do great work with cookbooks, but there are very, very, very few literary scholars who read cookbooks as works of literature. And I think that partly that's because literary scholars are shy about the body. And to read a cookbook and the way that a cookbook is, the cookbook as having form requires that you engage with the imagination of the body, and if not, in fact, the actions of the body. So cookbooks, stay tuned for a long time.
I can't wait. That's going to be so fascinating. And I can't wait to learn what you find in them and what you don't find, right? What's left out. That's going to be an amazing story. Thank you, Livia. This was absolutely riveting. Thank you so much.
So much. It was a
Really
pleasure.
powerful. Thank you so much.